Thank you. And it's my great pleasure to be here. And after the last few river trips, I've learned to generally take whatever invitations John offers me. So he did rope me into this one by promising a river trip next week. We're doing Cataract Canyon as soon as we get done here. And so I'm pretty excited about that. When I engaged in that act of civil disobedience back at the end of 2008, it seems like a radically different time in the climate movement between then and now. And sometimes it seems like both our challenges and our movement and our response are moving so quickly that it's strange to remember just how different things were even 6 or 7 years ago at that point. But really, at that point, when I engaged in that act of civil disobedience wasn't very well accepted in the environmental movement and the climate movement. And it seems like it's become such a mainstream thing at this point. But at that point, there were a lot of folks that were not very keen on civil disobedience in the climate movement. And so I ended up in this position of being somewhat of a critic of our movement and trying to push our movement and encourage our movement to be more aggressive and more confrontational and more idealistic and take bold stances. And so over the years, as I've had this national platform in the climate movement, I've spent a good deal of time critiquing the mainstream of the environmental movement. And I figured I've had enough of that for now that tonight I figured I should celebrate the mainstream and talk about what it is that's great about the mainstream. And being here at this conference of river keepers and the people who protect streams and rivers and know a lot about the mainstream, it got me to think about the mainstream in sort of a different way. And since I'm going on the river with John next week, it got me thinking literally about rivers and the mainstream that we're going to be in going down Cataract Canyon. And ever since I was a little kid, my mom would always be frustrated that I would take things too literally. So I figured maybe we should think about the mainstream in our movement in a more literal way and look at our rivers as a model of our movement. And when we look at the mainstream of our rivers, really the first thing that we've got to notice about the mainstream is that it's obviously the fastest part of the river. It's the part that moves the fastest. It's not the part that gets stuck spinning around in eddies, just staying in the same place. It's not the stagnant pools that grow some algae and things on them. It's the part that's moving fastest. That's always changing its perspective. And in a lot of social movements, in this movement and past social movements, there's always the forces of the movement that say, we need to be patient, we need to slow down, we need to be more reasonable, we need to compromise more. Certainly the civil rights movement had that. The whole reason that Martin Luther King had to write his letter from a Birmingham jail was that he was getting criticized from the comfortable liberals in the civil rights movement, saying slow down, take it easy, just wait, things will come. And that letter was a response of why we need to be moving faster. And over the past 6 or 7 years, we've seen a lot of fast movement in the climate movement. It was only a year before I disrupted the auction that a group called Rising Tide was formed thank you, that started trying to push the boundaries of what's acceptable in the climate movement and started talking about things in a different way. One, they started doing direct action, and they started also criticizing capitalism and saying we need to address the root causes of this and really look at how this is connected with our economic system and look at how it's connected with white supremacy and how it's connected with patriarchy and how it's connected with these fundamental issues. And they've gained chapters all over the country. They have gained a lot of momentum to the point that now they've been a core part of the organizing that's been going on up in Seattle with the fleet of kayaks that have been blocking the drill rig that Shell is trying to get up to Alaska. And and they've gotten so much support from local folks and from across the climate movement, that I think they really have a chance of actually keeping that drill rig there throughout the summer and preventing them getting up to the Arctic while they still have the window to drill. And their direct action is not only making symbolic statements like some of the civil disobedience that we see, which is still valuable, but I think it's growing to the point, it's growing so much momentum that it actually has the potential to make a tangible difference in this. As a indicator of just how mainstream Rising Tide has been when they became this radical voice 8 years ago, they're on the list of donations for Credo this year, or this month. Each month Credo Mobile, the phone company, has the list of progressive organizations that they donate to. And this year, or this month, Rising Tide is one of the 3 that's on that ballot. So they're so mainstream now that they're getting phone companies that support them. So I think that's a sign of how quickly things are shifting. We're also seeing really fast developments with the rising indigenous movement in this country that is approaching environmental justice and climate justice from a completely different perspective than our movement has had before, and showing some real leadership and pushing boundaries and setting the bar for a lot of the rest of us to start looking at things in deeper ways. We've seen a lot of progress with that. The next thing that we can notice about the mainstream of a movement is that too often we assume that the mainstream of the river is right out in the middle of the river, right? That's sort of the general assumption. And certainly in tranquil rivers that are kind of smooth and straightforward and don't have too many obstacles, certainly a lot of the times the mainstream is right out in the middle. But we're certainly not in tranquil times right now. We're not in straightforward times. And it seems like every time we go around one obstacle, there's 2 more that pop up in front of us. And in fact, some of our greatest visionaries of this age have called this the great turning, because there's so much upheaval in our society that there's this great turning that we're facing. And in fact, some of these folks who don't even really approach things from a strictly environmental perspective that talk about this great turning, sometimes they use the image, that iconic photograph of Horseshoe Bend on the Colorado River. I'm sure a lot of you would recognize that photo if you saw it, the big sweeping bend in this river that seems to bend almost 180 degrees and then almost 180 degrees back. That's their image of the age that we're in right now. And when you're rowing down a river and it's going around a really sharp turn like that, a lot of you'd probably know where that main stream of the river is going to be when it goes around a big turn. It's not going to be right in the middle, right? And it's not going to be on the inside of that turn where it's kind of gravelly and slow. The main stream of the river, when it goes around a sharp turn, is going to be right on the outside. And it's going to be crashing in to the wall of the canyon there. And it's just going to be confronting that big obstacle that's in its path. And it always seems to get pushed then in the opposite direction. But that confrontation with that obstacle is not futile, right? Because when we look from a longer term perspective, that river is wearing away that wall of that canyon and will soon, over geologic time, carve a new channel and new possibilities for where that river can go. It actually creates a new path forward where one didn't exist before. That's the result of all that constant confrontation with the obstacles that are in the way. And that, as well, I think, is where we see the mainstream of our movement, is those who are willing to engage in that confrontation against seemingly intrenchable obstacles that stand in the way of our progress. And more and more in our movement, we're getting individuals and organizations that are willing to challenge the things that we are told are impossible to change. More and more in our movement, we're getting folks that are willing to challenge the big structures that limit our progress. By far the most popular and well-received and talked about book over the past year in the climate movement has been This Changes Everything by Naomi Klein, that has gotten a lot of traction and a lot of mainstream support, where she talks about how in the process of dealing with climate change, we also need to deal with the other fundamental injustices in our world. We need to challenge corporate capitalism. We need to challenge corporate personhood, where we've seen some of the fastest growing developments in progressive movements over the past 5 years, is people being willing to challenge corporate personhood, where folks didn't even know what that was 6 years ago before Citizens United. And certainly, we're not going to end corporate personhood this year, just like we're not going to end growth capitalism this year. But we are consistently having these confrontations where we are wearing away these obstacles that limit our progress and open up new possibilities for our future. That's where we're seeing the mainstream of our movement. The other thing that we know about the mainstream of our movement, or the mainstream of a river, particularly in places like Cataract Canyon, where John and I are going to be next week, is that that's where the rapids are, and that's where the danger is. The mainstream of the river is where you might flip your boat. It's where you might get wet. It's where you might get hurt. And there might be real consequences for making a mistake. And that too, I think, is reflected in our movement. That increasingly, we've got folks in this movement that are not content to just play it safe and stick to the side channels and the slow eddies. We've got people that are willing to run those rapids and risk making mistakes and take a risk of making sacrifices. We've got more and more folks engaging in civil disobedience, even in challenging civil disobedience. One of the folks that I've been working with in Massachusetts, since I moved out there a couple years ago, are a few guys that anchored a lobster boat in front of the Brayton Point coal-fired power plant in southern Massachusetts, and they prevented a shipment of West Virginia coal. They prevented a shipment of West Virginia coal from being delivered to this power plant. And so, of course, they were arrested, they were prosecuted for this, and they were facing some real consequences. That action involved some real risk. They were facing about a year in prison. And so I was working with them, along with a lot of other folks, organizing around their trial and trying to bring a lot of attention to this. And we had a lot of media there for their trial. We had clergy there. We had a lot of community supporters. And then on the day of their trial, when it looked like, you know, they'd probably get convicted and they'd probably have to deal with those risks that they knew they were heading towards as they entered into this rapid, the strange thing happened was that the district attorney took over the prosecution of the case and dropped all the criminal charges, and then came outside to all the folks that we had organized, to all the media that we had brought there, and gave this speech about how he was dropping the charges out of concern for all the children that would be impacted by climate change. He said there'd been a serious failure of political leadership on this issue, and it justified actions like this. He had a copy of Bill McKibben's Rolling Stone article that he held up, and he said, I've been making all my staff read this, and he said, I'm going to be at the climate march in a few weeks. And then he went on a speaking tour with the defendants, talking about the severity of climate change. So it was one of those moments where they were right in the heart of the danger, right in the heart of the rapid, and just when they thought that it wasn't possible, they popped out and were right side up on the other side. One of those magic moments, you know, and that as well is one of the other factors about the mainstream of a river, and part of the reason that a lot of us run rivers in the first place is that the mainstream of the river, that's where the fun is, right? That the risk and the rapids are exactly what make it worth taking that trip and going down that river. And that, too, I think, is true about the mainstream of our movement, of the radicals that are pushing the boundaries and the people that are trying to move the fastest and the people that are taking the risks. That's also where the most fun is, that we get to challenge things that people say can't be challenged, and we get to have these glorious struggles against huge unjust forces that everybody says can't be won, and we get to do it anyway, and actually put our values into practice. And that is, I think, when we feel most alive, and that's certainly been my experience of engaging in this civil disobedience, and perhaps the part of it that surprised me the most, that surprised me even from that day right there in the auction, was just how good it felt at a really deep level. That up until that point, I'd felt so frustrated and constantly angry in my life, and constantly felt like my sentiment in regards to climate change being the greatest crisis that we face was not at all in line with my action of changing my light bulbs and riding my bike more and signing some petitions every once in a while. And at that moment, when I was going all out in that auction, I felt like the first time my actions were actually in line with my sentiment. And I felt so alive on a deep level. I felt so in flow that it was that amazing, uplifting feeling of knowing that we are in flow with forces so much more powerful than ourselves. And that is when I felt most alive. And as I've continued down that mainstream of the movement that has been moving so quickly over the past 6 years, at the times when I'm fighting the hardest and most engaged in this work is also when I'm having the most fun and feeling the most alive, knowing that I'm completely in flow with these powerful forces that we are working to protect. And this is the final thing that I'll say about the mainstream of rivers. And this is where you might regret that you invited a divinity school student to come talk to you while you eat, is where the mainstream is headed in all of its movement and all of the obstacles that the mainstream of the river tries to overcome, and all of the rapids that the mainstream flows through. It's always the part of the river that is pointed towards the ocean. It's the part of the river that is not content to sit in isolated pools and small side channels, but it's the part that flows towards that integration with all the water on the planet. It's the part that seeks an interconnectedness with the ocean, that always flows in that direction. And that's the other thing that I've seen about the mainstream of the climate movement, is that it's not just an environmental movement anymore, that it's not just this single issue thing that operates in isolation, but that it seeks an interconnectedness. The mainstream of our movement that is moving the fastest and confronting the most barriers is that part of our movement that has a deeply intersectional analysis of how climate change is connected to so many other forms of oppression and exploitation in our world and in our society, and works on all of them together. It's the part of our movement that recognizes that if black lives actually mattered in our country, or that if they mattered enough, that we would have solved climate change after Hurricane Katrina, when we had a clear picture of what climate change looks like in human terms, but that clear picture of what climate change looked like in human terms was black people on a rooftop. And that's a picture that's not likely to change, because climate change is hitting the poor and people of color around the world harder than it's hitting white people and wealthy people. And that picture wasn't enough to spur this country into the kind of drastic change that we need to deal with the climate crisis. And so the mainstream of our movement is that part of it that realizes that we can't solve the climate crisis, we can't even appropriately address the climate crisis and mobilize the kind of effort that we need if we don't also deal with racial justice at the same time, in the same efforts. That we can't deal with climate justice and actually create the kind of world that we want to see if we don't also deal with immigrant rights, if we don't also deal with labor rights, if we don't also deal with the concentration of wealth. And now we have a movement that is working in a much more interconnected way with so many other social justice movements, and combining with the labor movement and the net neutrality movement and the anti-corporate movement and the anti-globalization movement to have victories like we saw today in Washington, with a victory that everybody told us was impossible, of stopping the fast track of the TPP. That mainstream of the movement is moving faster than ever before. And so I'm excited to be here tonight, and after all my years of critiquing the mainstream, I'm glad to invite you all to be a part of that mainstream and move as fast as we all can towards our goal. Thank you very much.